and welcome back to HerWILL's Life and Leadership series. I am Naaz Hassan and I welcome you back to pick up the discussion where we left off on our last segment, discussing the core factors that create a favorable grounds for what eventually leads to sex and gender-based violence. We have with us joining again a brilliant set of panelists tonight from the fields of sociology, anthropology, and gender studies. Leading the discussion is Professor Dr. Ilora Halim Chaudhry from the University of Massachusetts, followed by Dr. Nadeem Malik from the University of Melbourne, and Professor Dr. Vinita Sinha from the National University of Singapore. Welcome back, everyone, to our Life and Leadership series discussion.
I'll just quickly go through Dr. Ilora Chaudhry now. Just wanted to pick up the reins there and I think delve further into the matter. As we were saying, there seems to be an added value, quote unquote, so to speak, to this category of violence, gendered violence, to be used as a weapon of war, as a weapon in politics, any conflict situations, really. Because besides that physiological damage that the SGVs are able to inflict, there's also that shame and there's that powerful impact of that. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about, drawing from your experience with the acid attack cases in Bangladesh, that psychology you think that's prevalent behind the crime and also for the criminal?
Sure. So just to comment about what you mentioned about gender violence and the use of rape as a weapon of war. Certainly, if we look at the history of South Asia, we'll see that during partition, sexual violence committed against Hindu communities by Muslim communities, and also sexual violence committed by Hindu and Sikh communities on, Muslim communities, that was certainly used as a way to subdue and dominate and humiliate a particular community. And we also saw in the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971, of course, where again, sexual violence against women was used as a strategy of war and to subdue the Bengali population, and West Pakistani army actively engaged in that. And so again, there is, of course, that legacy of breaking the spirit of the nation, breaking the spirit of a community, of a family, of a kinship structure, by the humiliation of women. So as Dr. Sinha was suggesting, that yes, women are considered to be the custodians of culture and honor, and thereby symbolically to violate a woman is to violate that community or that family or that nation. And certainly this notion of shaming and I would add commodification and this sort of ownership of women is very much part of patriarchal culture and norms, and something that I have observed in my research having to do with acid attacks against women and girls in Bangladesh. So for instance, if you look at the causes that are cited for acid attacks, they're often the higher number of cases are cited as land dispute or property dispute. Secondarily, there's also a high category of cases that will cite family dispute. A lesser number of cases have to do with rejection of sexual advances or romantic overtures towards a woman or an adolescent girl by a man in the community. And in all of these cases, we see that when there's a dispute about property, it is the women who bear the brunt. In whether it's a family dispute, it is women predominantly, again, who are attacked as a means to, again, mark that family, but also to end the social and economic life of the woman in question as well. Because, you know, acid violence, what it does is it not only disfigures the woman, in most cases where women are attacked, they are attacked on the face. And again, it's a way you can read patriarchal culture where a particular value is placed on the woman's appearance, right? So society values the appearance of the woman, and the disfigurement means that she's no longer a commodity in the sense that there is an issue in marrying the woman because, you know, the face has been disfigured. Also, her social and economic value is at question because these attacks also lead to extreme isolation. So often you'll have a loss of hearing, loss of eyesight, such that women are not able to go to school or go back to work. And therefore, it's sort of meant to end their public lives in a way. Also, in the cases having to do with rejection of a sexual or romantic advance, you know, oftentimes what you will hear the perpetrator would have said to the victim is that, well, if I can't have you, no one else can. So this idea that women are property of men to be owned and possessed is very much evident in the way that the violence manifests. But I will also say, you know, in terms of the psyche of perpetrators, you know, I haven't really extensively talked to men who perpetrate violence, but in some of the research reports that we have seen come out in South Asia and in Bangladesh, what it suggests is that in a lot of cases, and here I'm talking again about sexual violence, in a lot of cases, men who have been interviewed, who have perpetrated violence against women, will say that, well, if they knew that they were going to be prosecuted, if they knew that they were going to be charged with a crime, perhaps they would not have done it. So again, you know, this idea that one can get away with perpetrating this kind of extreme violence against women is very much pervasive. And that has to do with, again, the culture of impunity that we were talking about earlier, where there is little accountability and follow through by various institutions, right? So this is the legal institutions or the police and the state institutions. There's very little follow through, lack of resources in following through that create a kind of culture of violence where these kinds of trends increase and are sort of enabled, and people are empowered to go on and engage in these kinds of acts without much, you know, follow through or legal consequences. And also, I would say that, you know, this idea of owning and ownership of women, obviously having to do with patriarchal cultural norms. But when we are talking about sexual violence and sexuality, there is also very little discussion of women's agency or consent or acknowledgement in the sense of that, women are themselves can be sexual beings, that they can ascertain a consent at which point and how and when. These kinds of conversations are almost entirely out of the equation. And again, it is sort of, we normalize the culture of violence by using language like, well, men behave this way. So, it is women who have to sort of discipline themselves, and their behavior have to be policed and watched and curtailed, because it is, for men to sort of behave a certain way as actors and doers in the equation, whereas women are sort of, seen as the passive beings to whom such acts are committed or they're acted upon and done. And we very much normalize that in our day-to-day actions and realities in the social context. So this notion that, women themselves are actors, that themselves are doers, that they have the so they have the right to determine their own sexual lives, is something that's completely absent in the conversation about, when we talk about living within a culture of violence. And another side to it, of course, I would also just bring in the legal side, right? So that there is a perception that, yes, if you have stronger laws and stricter laws, perhaps violence against women would decrease in society. Now, of course, having strong laws and enforcement of laws and sort of, implementation of laws are very important, but laws in itself, again, cannot change this kind of social and cultural context of violence. So the legal structure itself often reflects these kinds of social and political inequalities within which these acts occur. And we also have to think about, how do laws even imagine women and women's agency? And that's very much part of a patriarchal cultural context. So, in South Asia, and I think this is true across the region, that, we are working with this sort of Victorian laws that determine that, when cases are brought forth and prosecuted, that there is this provision to question a victim's character, that in itself is a deterrent for actually filing a case, or let alone sort of going through the trial in itself, because of course victims are often doubly victimized through the process when such kinds of character assassinations are happening. There's also the law also will reflect political and social inequalities, in the sense that there's such a low number of cases that are actually filed, or ones that actually reach the end of the trial process. I think the numbers are abysmally low, and in that context, we also have to think about are there provisions in place that ensure the security of witnesses? There are large-scale cases of witness in harassment, intimidation. In some cases, even in my research, I have seen that even when you have laws put in place which reflects rising trends in violence. So, for instance, when acid attacks were really at a high level in late 90s, early 2000s, there were laws enacted specifically to control acid attacks, and also the sale and purchase of acid. However, the implementation, again, was not adequate. There was not enough, sort of monitoring, so law in itself will not ensure, again, that you have to sort of look at if there's a structure in place that's actually monitoring all of these sides that create a context where such crimes occur. And the weakening of the institutions, or the weak institutions, actually, whether they're social or legal, or if you're talking about state institutions, often are, that point gets lost when we put this emphasis on culture and tradition. It's almost, it obscures the fact that that we haven't seen a lot of change in terms of the strengthening of these institutions that could protect women, protect victims adequately. And then, it's sort of an easy, in some ways, easy to suggest that it is culture that is to blame. Culture can be used as an alibi in that sense, whereas the larger issue could also be strengthening of institutions.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Dr. Chaudhry. I think one of the most valid points, or for me personally at least, was one of the things that you talked about, the cases. In terms of sex and gender-based violence, I think there is this assumption that a vast majority of the cases are related to a romantic advance being rejected, or, some sort of a prior relationship based that went wrong, and then the extreme point of violence was reached. But it's actually not the case, like you pointed out. It could be about a land dispute. It could be, an agenda against another family member. But the woman is targeted, as you said, because there is that vast, there is a bigger outcome to be achieved via it. There's the weakening of the system to be achieved via it. So I think in both the cases of the 1947, the partition in South Asia, and the 1971, the liberation war in Bangladesh, where we've actually seen that sex and gender-based violence have been used as a major instrument, as a major weapon of war as well. So those are very, very extremely interesting points. Just three things that are coming across from all of you, all of the speakers here today. I think three similar streams that I've been able to follow on. One of them is, the whole identity, the establishment of what it means to be male, what it means to be female, as majorly pointed out by Dr. Sinha. The second point is women's agency and how that threatens the authority or that power structure, and why that, there is that another additional motive for it to be subdued, that voice to be subdued. And the third point that came up across from all three of you had been the impunity, the patriarchal nature of the structure and the legal system in place at the moment, which are anti-women, because it serves the purpose, and culture is often used as a means to achieve that. So thank you. Some of the points raised had been very, very interesting. Moving on, I think I'd just go to you, Dr. Nadim Malik. We just, heard about the psychology that was behind some of the acid attack victims and the possible intent that could vary anywhere between land dispute to an actual, like a romantic gesture going wrong. But what we need your help in understanding is the psychology of a sex and gender-based violence survivor. We often talk about survivor in very plain terms, without acknowledging the extensive nature of the impact. And it's unfortunate because in some cases, I also believe it indicates that there's a better or easier chance of finding justice when the victim doesn't actually survive. We've seen that in very many cases. So from your experience and historical findings, could you share why sex and gender-based violence is different?
Well, of course, there is a sex-based violence and gender-based violence. Sex-based violence primarily, refers to sexualized acts of violence, including rape, sexual assault, sexual abuse. While gender-based violence can be referred to acts of violence that are, um, enacted against a victim based on either their gender identity or expression. So that's the major difference. But although I'm not a psychologist, I don't claim to have any expertise in that field. But especially in sexual-based violence, for example, rape, um it, its impact on the victim is most can be most distressing, horrendous and demeaning, experience for anyone who has faced this kind of violence, and it almost always leaves the victim with feelings of self-loathing, self-blame, and rage, and can cause post-traumatic syndrome disorder. And then such feelings are exacerbated because somewhere in their subconscious, the victims always, have this sense that rape is not a behavioral or mental disorder. It is a criminal offense. And the fact that some rapists, might have a psychological disorder, there's no such disorder, that can compel people to rape. Then more importantly, at the social level, again, losing family honor, which to me is a taxonomy of power actually, and political taxonomy, and the accompanied future insecurity, in a highly patriarchal society, proves to be really a traumatic experience for the victim.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Malik. I'll just quickly go to you, Dr. Vinita Sinha. The fear of violence is detrimental to women's pursuit of personal and professional excellence in any strata, and threatens equally our HerWILL's goals and objectives as well, which is why we raise this very important question. This fear that also Dr. Malik and Dr. Chaudhary touched upon as well, the fear, it's particularly rife in South Asian communities and diaspora right now due to all the recent incidents. From your fieldwork and overall research, could you share some examples of the best ways as how community members not favored or minority or marginalized community members in a time of crisis have risen in the face of such adversities in the past, or any other examples you can think of?
Thank you, Naaz. Thank you for that question. So the fear of violence is absolutely debilitating. I think, both panelists have highlighted how, just the sort of the possibility that there could be violence committed against women is the huge barrier, and women do end up sort of self-policing, self-regulating, and thereby very often conforming to particular kinds of behaviors. And again, in this instance, the security question is always shifted to the potential victim, right? That you need to take action in order to protect yourself rather than rely on external factors. In my own work that I've done, which, as you mentioned, has been on the Hindu diaspora in Singapore and Malaysia, and as you know, the history of migration to these regions is that the communities that migrated here were largely from the lowest categories of the caste hierarchy in the Indian context. And given my work in these communities, as well as my my role as an educator, I've been very interested in the notion of marginality and what it means to be a member of a minority, right? Not just a numerical minority, but a minority that has, been marginalized because it has been denied access to resources and sort of structurally disempowered, etc. So I have a keen interest in the notion of marginality, what it means to be on the margins, how do margins get identified, who decides who's marginal, and I've done work in these communities that came from these lowest rungs of the caste hierarchy, who, ironically, even when they migrated to other shores, continued to face the same kinds of, problems in terms of, the Brahminical orthodoxies that had been reinstituted in diasporic locales, where Sanskritic, elitist, text-based Hinduism becomes dominant. So, my research with these groups has really led me to think of marginality and minority status in, and I'm glad to say, in more enabling and productive modes. I think there is a sort of a tendency to think of marginalization as debilitating and unproductive, but I've been quite encouraged in the work that I've done, both with this community, but also, I should add, as an administrator, I've been working with the university on how to produce sort of enlightened and progressive policies to manage sexual harassment on campuses, right? And in both the works that I've done, I've actually, been led to think of marginality in more enabling terms. And I've seen my interlocutors being critical, questioning, challenging dominant, mainstream, exclusionary, and discriminatory practices and norms, and really refusing to take the status quo for granted. And what I've seen is members sort of disengaging and from mainstream ways of doing things and conceiving alternative ways of conceptualizing themselves and creating fields of possibilities and actions. Now, I want to offer a caveat. I don't mean to romanticize marginality, exclusion, or discrimination, because marginality, again, is not a homogeneous monolith, right? There are many different ways of thinking about marginality, and indeed, marginal communities in South Asia, and this includes Dalit communities, indigenous communities, as well as women in these contexts, right, are sort of disenfranchised and disempowered and suffer from different kinds of systemic and structural oppressions and have limited resources and social capital. And these are real challenges, so I don't mean to undermine these at all. But from the work that has been done, both in the Southeast Asian context with diasporas and in South Asia by NGOs and civil society groups, one of the best strategies in the face of adversity that has been tried and tested, I think, is to really propagate this message that moments of crisis can also be moments of inspiration, and that one can actually derive some plan for alternative action rather than be paralyzed into inaction. And this is something that I've really seen in the work that I've done, both in my study of popular Hinduism, because I work on popular Hinduism, which is really Hinduism from the ground up, which is practiced by communities that, come from low caste backgrounds, etc. So, and I've seen in all these cases where critique is a really important starting point, the spirit of questioning, right? A refusal to take things for granted, right? And to exercise agency, to assert one's will. And I'm very aware that these are not easy things to do by any means, right? I think, these are sort of broad principles that I think are very important. The idea that one needs to critique, to continuously question, to refuse to take things for granted, to be assertive, to be agentic, to discover the capacity and potential that one does have, right? And these things take courage and are difficult, and need to be translated into practice through particular kinds of programs which can instill both consciousness raising and a set of life skills within these communities. So I mean, because at an abstract level, just the idea that one should be critical doesn't mean anything. It really needs to be translated into practice. And I mean, I do that through pedagogy in my classrooms, consciousness raising. But of course, in the South Asian context, we know that women's groups and feminist groups and NGOs and civil society groups have been working on devising community level programs, in partnership with others, other stakeholders like media, like, local communities, state authorities, even to craft and curate skills, concrete skills through which this desire to critique and be assertive and be agentic can actually be translated into practice. And I think these are some of the best strategies, right? And the change has to begin at the level of raising consciousness, right? And I also, in the spirit of feminist inquiry and practice, I don't sort of speak the language of women should be empowered. Rather, I would speak the language of women and minority and marginal groups should empower themselves, right? And so what kind of conditions, social and political, and much has been said earlier, about legal structures and the need for legal structures, etc. Yes, I mean, the institutional landscape is really key. One needs to think about what kinds of landscapes, institutional landscapes, legal infrastructures can be produced, as an environment, as a backdrop against which some of these kind of broader ethical principles about being agentic and being committed to change can actually be materialized.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. I think you've put a positive spin to the conversation at this stage, which I really appreciate. But yeah, also what you talked about, at a community level, not to be paralyzed into inaction. I think those words would really inspire our HerWILL community, which is trying to come to terms with these recent incidents and news of violence. But also just wanted to touch upon what you mentioned about the already, local NGOs, grassroots level organizations, already the kind of community level programs that are put into place that should increase that desire to critique and the question. I think that's something a very essential takeaway message from there. But I just want to continue that conversation where you also mentioned media, and go to you, Dr. Elora Chaudhry, just to expand that, the positioning and the role played by media in general. In the recent debate, especially in Bangladesh, I'm sure you have noticed, a key mention I find is regarding pornography and media portrayals of gender overall being key to this conversation. Now, there is one group stating that when we cite pornography as a reason for this category of violence, we undermine the fact that rape is about power, essentially. It's not about sexual desires. How much of these sex and gender-based violence would you say is due to an imbalance of power in these societies that we're talking about? And if you were to list, say, the main reasons why they happen, just based on your experience and area of expertise, what would they be?
I would absolutely say that sexual violence, rape is about power. And even if we go back to the 3 cases that I had raised in the beginning of the session, in each instance, we saw that, there was the perpetrators were empowered by their association with local political groups, that many of them were repeat offenders. In the case of rape in the Chittagong Hill Tracts area, we saw there's, this sort of ethnic violence against the marginalized community, to subdue, to threaten, to dominate, to conquer. It is very much about power. And, what has been talked about in the recent cases about videotaping and circulating, we also have to think about the details of the case, that in fact, the perpetrators had been assaulting the woman for a long period of time, and that they were asking for money from her. And if she did not comply, then she was being threatened with uh, sexual violence and the release of this video. And also in this case, the victim talks about that in her sort of marginalized economic and social positionality, she really did not think that she could go to the police. So all of these factors have to do with power, about protecting power, about sanctioning power of the people responsible for such violent attacks. And in terms of the increased circulation of pornography, I was recently actually attending a webinar that was hosted by Jahangirnagar University in Bangladesh, and one of the speakers mentioned that a particular case from the 80s where a sexual assault had been videotaped and then it was being sold in the market. So I think, again, in that case, the person who was selling this video wielded power over the person that he had assaulted and attacked. And with increased media availability, and of course, we know that with more intense availability and circulation, the way that such stories get told and commodified, I mean, there is an effect on that. And of course, pornography objectifies women. Pornography is often violent and objectifying to women. And I think that certainly might have an effect on the ways in which the violence manifests. But it is nonetheless very much about enacting a kind of power.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for raising. Dr. Nadeem Malik, I'll just go to you next. I personally find this quite disturbing that, of any violence against women incident when they come up, there is an absence and silence of everyday common men in the discussion of these incidents. There is a hesitation involved. And, any comments you want to make regarding what you suppose goes through the minds of South Asian men in particular when they hear about incidents of sexual violence? Is there a hidden guilt that exists? We talked about the small steps leading towards sex and gender-based violence just then. Do you think because most men out there are privy to certain locker room discussions and in their own ways play a part in a bigger picture, there is this hesitation in wholeheartedly condemning this category of violence?
Yeah, I think there's generally a certain culture of violence that prevails, especially in those countries in South Asia which have been ruled by military dictators. But generally, there is a certain numbness and indifference that exists not only regarding violence against women, but on many other issues. I can give you an example. Like in Pakistan, in last 15 years, there are 70,000 people who have been killed by terrorists attacks, and hardly anyone has ever organized any procession or raised any voices, so there's lack of disorganization. People, even if they feel about it, they are not organized. And mobs are never organized. You need certain institutions, certain political forces, strong civil society, state institutions, which provide certain direction to people and organize people on certain forums. So I think that institution, people do feel, I think, and now gradually they have started sort of raising their voice to some extent, but through civil society organization. In this recent incidents of rape in on motorway in Lahore that you talked about, there was a rage, there was a kind of fury, and women rights organizations, civil society organizations, they did organize some certain protests. So people, I think, are willing to come on streets, but they don't know, they lack direction. They lack these societies lack those institutions which are which could organize people on these line and help them raise their voice. Mob doesn't have a face, you have to give them a face, and only certain institutions, state institutions, civil society institutions, political parties, rights-based organizations, they have to do a lot of work, I think. As our panelists also, other panelists also mentioned, there's significant need for awareness raising, advocacy, and uh, so this numbness, indifference is because of this again is has multi is a multifaceted issue. There's so much poverty, there's so much deprivation, there's so much marginality that exists in these societies, that people have somehow become numb, even if they feel. I have observed myself, and through my own research, that people do feel, if there is some rape, child abuse, for example, people do feel, and but somehow they don't come. There is no organized voice, you know, and that is because of lack of institution and institutional failure, I think, in most cases. And there is absolutely a need for organization like the kind of work now that you are trying to do. We need such organizations which could give people voice, which could make awareness. My own experience as a cultural activist, specifically, during the General Ziaul Haq military regime, we talked about media. I think media is also largely controlled by corporate interests, and in some cases by the state as well. So there's also a need for alternative media. And we had in in mid 80s, we, for example, utilized cultural implements for creating awareness, especially on children rights and human rights and women rights issues. And for example, street theater, it became so effective. At that time, we only had one state-controlled media, and there was no alternative media which could voice people's concerns. And we used to go on streets, and we did plays everywhere in the entire country, and created hundreds of such street theater groups. We used, painting murals, which we would mount on buses, and would move around the city, and we would stop at certain intersections and make speeches. So, so I think there's a need for alternative media as well for creating such awareness. empowering people, and also, I'm not convinced somehow that people don't feel about these things. I think they're not organized. They're not aware also. They're not informed also on many things. So there is a need for sensitizing them, educating them, making them aware, doing advocacy through various means, and I think cultural implements, and especially alternative cultural implements, can be very effective.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. That's very true. Two important points raised. One is having an organized, confident voice, relaying these issues, and a possible need for an alternative media in the portrayal that comes in an
Yeah.
alternative reality as well,
Yeah.
rather than what we always see in a structured manner. Thank you for that. I'll just quickly go to you, Dr. Vinitha Sinha now. Dr. Chaudhary raised this earlier, in regards to rule of law. In most countries, especially in South Asia, it's critiqued to be highly patriarchal and archaic. A prime example, which also Dr. Chaudhary brought up, is about rape survivors having to go to that witness stand as part of the proceedings, which is, I just want to ask you, have you ever had an experience in any of the groups that you've studied where, fear, obviously, which we discussed earlier, had been the leading source of action or inaction? Because it seems like a lonely journey in terms of women empowerment, in it that there doesn't seem to be reasonable protection, as some of the other panelists have touched upon earlier, that specifically applies to women. There is a need for equity rather than equality. So from your study of marginalized diaspora, are you able to draw parallels and explain the need for this equity versus equality?
Right. Thank you. So, allow me to actually draw from my ongoing work on how universities manage instances of sexual harassment and misconduct, which I think can speak to this issue well, rather than my work on Indian diasporas, because the Indian community in Singapore, actually, although it's a numerical minority, has done really well in the last 50 years, and really doesn't qualify as a marginalized community in that sense, despite its small size. But of course, despite that, there are all kinds of discriminations and racisms that do exist in Singapore against ethnic minorities, and certainly the Indian community and other minority communities have over the decades been quite vocal in calling out these racist discriminatory practices and really asking for sort of integrity, equity, and respect in terms of how they should be treated. But speaking specifically to women, I want to draw on my work on trying to be involved in a conversation at the National University of Singapore in crafting progressive and enlightened policies. And in this context, I've done work with students and with faculty members, and conducted focus group discussions with students across the university, just trying to understand what motivates them to either act or not act. Now, as everybody, I think, on this panel knows, and this we know long before the Me Too movement became sort of visible and conspicuous, right? University campuses are rife environments for sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, right? I mean, all the reports and data that we have globally show very clearly that this is endemic. It's not confined to universities, of course, and of course universities have struggled to come up with policies and practices and procedures that can address this. But in my conversations with students, especially female students on campuses, I have encountered women expressing anxieties and fears as victims or potential victims of sexual harassment. These anxieties and fears, unfortunately, have been debilitating because they discourage official, complaints and reporting, right? And to the authorities. And this ties up with your question on the rule of law and how people think about law, right? So, my conversation certainly revealed that women do not trust the existing procedures and policies to deal meaningfully and justly with perpetrators of sexual misconduct, right? Unfortunately, there is still a great deal of work that needs to be done, in crafting progressive policies that will empower victims to come forward and demand justice, right? So much like legal systems, university policies also reflect attendant patriarchal biases and carry problematic views about women's own role in cases of sexual harassment and misconduct. And of course, we've talked about victim blaming, victim shaming, right? And social and legal provisions rest on perceiving women as victims and subjects. So clearly laws are not enough, nor are policies. The need to strengthen their implementation and practice and to enhance institutional accountability are really important, right? And to also improve gender sensitivity and attention to survivors, right? How does, and first of all, we shouldn't be talking about victims. We should really be talking, I mean, the whole discourse, I think, is part of what needs to change in talking about equity in that sense, because the inequalities that women as victims face actually is carried very much in the language and the terminology that is used to even define, their experiences, right? So I think one needs to pay particular attention to the discourse itself. And of course, to attend to this idea of violence as being stigmatized. So cases of sexual harassment never get reported or don't get reported because it carries a huge deal of stigma. And female students will say, well, I don't really want to be associated with this particular case. Every time somebody enters my name in a search engine on the internet, the first thing that comes up is that I made a report. And they worry about their careers, they worry about their reputations, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, women do get flack and are chastised for reporting or seeking support services and justice. So there is tremendous lack of trust in the system. And this fear of coming forward because there's just the view that there's not going to be redress. So how do we encourage women to come forward, because sometimes coming forward induces further violence and further stigmatization, as has been mentioned with how police and courts function. So I think, in terms of sort of talking about equity, of course, we talk about rights and entitlements and privileges and those kind of things. But I think equity is more than a kind of a formal granting of rights and privileges, right? It's really about removing this sort of endemic stigma that is experienced by women and girls who face violence, right? And it's important, I think, in seeking equity to make this violence visible, public, and unacceptable, and also morally outrageous. I think that's really key. And of course, then we can talk about encouraging alternative and more equitable attitudes and how those would translate into equitable, sort of equitable practices. But for me, it's more than a formal recognition of equality. It's about kind of changing these very deep-seated ways in which members of communities continue to think about both violence as well as those who face such violence.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. All the very best with your efforts. It's very commendable that you're currently undertaking regarding the sexual misconduct policies. And I loved how you raised that policies and laws in general need to empower survivors or victims that face these sort of situations rather than discouraging them from coming out. And yeah, that's sort of defeating the purpose. And also, yes, definitely, there needs to be a big shift in attitudes and mindset. And one of the stepping stones to that is certainly the naming that you touched upon before as well. Our language is one of the most critical things to be addressed. We're almost coming to an end of this discussion today. So just as one of the closing comments, Dr. Elora Chaudhary, just want to ask you, would you say sex and gender-based violence is a unique crime with its own, sets of signs and symbols, which requires a unique response as well, or a, unique remedial strategy, and demands like hang the rapist just doesn't cut it? I think you've raised that in your previous comment already. Just if you could elaborate on that. And I ask you first, because you've seen it firsthand with those acid attack violence cases in Bangladesh before, what has worked and what hasn't. So if you could just suggest what you believe are the best ways to move forward.
Thank you. Yes, actually, one of the things that I argued in my book, Transnationalism Reversed, is that there is a need for a broad-based um, solidarity movement organizing around gender-based violence. And what we have also seen since in the last 3 decades, or since the mid 90s, is an increasing fragmentation in social movement organizing. And there is this trend of NGOization of social movements and de-radicalization of grassroots organizing, sort of a donor-driven approach to social mobilization. And perhaps, that conversation is the topic for another webinar. So I'm not going to go into that in very much detail, but just to say that the acid campaign is often cited as a very successful one in Bangladesh. And if you look at it, it has certain successes. It also has certain limitations. Of course, one of the main successes is that the numbers have decreased so significantly. And the numbers decreased significantly also in part because the campaign itself had such a broad-based, multi-pronged approach. So if you look at the work of the Acid Survivors Foundation, which of course it does in collaboration with a number of organizations in Bangladesh, is that there is a research and advocacy wing. There is a medical unit, there is a legal unit, there is also a prevention unit. Dr. Malik was talking about cultural activist organizing in Pakistan, and that in fact is a very big part of the work that the Survivors Network in Bangladesh, with the support of the Acid Survivors Foundation, is engaged with. So there are in fact dozens of survivors of violence who themselves are advocates in the work around acid prevention. And there are traveling theater groups, music groups, art groups that have outreach to far corners of the country. They work with educational institutions in raising awareness about acid violence in particular, but also gender norms. And it is sort of this multi-pronged approach, I think, that has really contributed, along with the laws that have been enacted that I was talking about earlier. Nevertheless, there is also criticism that this campaign was unable to tap into a lot of resources. And in part, it is because of the global women's organizing that was happening around the world, women's conferences, particularly in 1995, the Beijing World Conference and sort of the Beijing Platform of Action, and the activist organizations, women's rights organizations in Bangladesh, being able to tap into some of those networks and putting pressure on the national government to enact policy and bring about policy change. And also because, acid violence against women and girls is also considered to be a spectacular violence. This is something that, we were talking about the whole idea of South Asian countries or certain regions in the world being excessively patriarchal, which is an assumption. And certainly, feminist scholars like Inderpal Grewal have talked about how in Western countries we have this tendency to outsource patriarchy to certain parts of the world, as if there is no patriarchal cultural norms in the West. But when we talk about violence against women in South Asia, in the Middle East, we frame it within tradition, within culture. And clearly, that is very problematic. But in some cases, when you translate a particular campaign in the words, in the language of international norms and platforms, there is a certain appeal to spectacular violence. And that can also bring a kind of attention and resource to mobilize a particular kind of movement around that spectacular violence. And I would say that the campaign work of acid violence was certainly able to tap into that. Now, of course, there were positive outcomes of that, but there are also limits. So, this whole fragmentation of movement, NGOs not working within broad-based issues of gender equity, right? So that is certainly an area that I think much work needs to be done. But I will also say that the women's movement in Bangladesh, is very strong and has made tremendous strides. And it, even with the recent trends that we have observed in Bangladesh, we have seen just thousands of people of all walks of life protesting, demanding action and accountability. And I was looking at the 9-point demand that has been presented by sort of youth groups and civil society groups. And if you look at the demands, and they have to do with accountability, they have to do with education, they have to do with legal reform, they have to do with providing security and safety for witnesses, and also creating cells in education institutions, ensuring security of women from harassment. All of these demands, they're not new. They have been part of the broad-based women's movement for a very long time. And perhaps, it is back to that question of accountability and impunity, and sort of the slow movement that we see often. And, again, the protection of a powerful groups in society who are then sanctioned to perpetuate the culture of violence and enact these sorts of violence. And that is really where the failures also are, and have to do with, associated with institutional failures too. So I think, while I am very much inspired and a strong supporter of the broad-based women's movement in Bangladesh, I think, our efforts also have to lie with strengthening of institutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaudhry. I'm very conscious of going over time. So just very, very quickly, last comments from you, Dr. Nadine Malik. What has worked, what hasn't? What would you say are the best steps forwards?
Well, I think in case of Pakistan, nothing much has worked so far, and mainly because of a very kind of dictatorial regimes, and in the civilian, during civilian times, we always have been having kind of hybrid regime with military domination. But in some other countries and some experiences in Pakistan, I would first of all, emphasize, the role of civil society, um, to raise awareness, and advocacy, and we need massive programs for that. And as Dr. You know, uh, Laura Chaudhary also mentioned regarding Bangladesh, these cultural means, alternative cultural means, can be very, very, very effective, and we need to create more and more such groups. But then, awareness has to be raised, and there has to be certain community pressure that has to be raised regarding structural reforms to increase police accountability, training for police, prosecutors and judges in handling sexual violence cases, protection for victims and witnesses, services, and legal assistance for survivors, and also an end to abusive and scientifically meaningless this virginity examinations in sexual violence cases, and also to measures to improve safety of public spaces, which is very, very crucial, without restricting mobility of women, trans and non-binary people. So and some of these awareness and education on these issues has proved pretty beneficial. One thing which I think is also important is that we need to create a lot of awareness on our school and school pedagogy, and textbooks, because textbooks are so gender biased. They're full of historical distortion as well, and they actually alienate and have been alienating people from their cultural heritage. So my argument is that in countries like India, Pakistan, there's been a cultural alienation, which is another major cause of gender-based violence and gender uh, sense, people's consciousness towards gender, because they're not aware of their historical heritage. We, in many cases, simply because their education is not provided in their mother tongue. For example, if you take in Punjab, in our part of the Punjab, Pakistan, people are not aware of Bulle Shah, Shah Hussain, Waris Shah, the entire classic literature. All these poets who have been doing poetry in feminine voice. You'll be
So
surprised.
important.
Their poetry is in feminine voice, and there's huge cultural resource to empower people on gender issues, yeah, and empower women on these issues. You take the theme of Shiv and Shakti. Shiv, it is the Shakti, it is this feminine force that dances around slumbering Shiv. You know, so these are these are our culture. This is our cultural heritage, which is very relevant to what I would call, through which we can sort of articulate our own kind of feminist thinking, which is there in our cultural history. And of course, the patriarchy historically in India was very different from the West. So what was the nature of that patriarchy? If you read Arthashastra, for example, from Kautilya, and you come to know a lot about women's situation at that time, which was so different from the rest of the world. So cultural alienation of people and their association with the state's interpretation, or this interpretation of dominant interest groups in societies of the culture, which has been to large extent been naturalized. For example, in India, what Modi is doing in the name of Hindutva. that doesn't represent people culture. That doesn't represent what people actually are doing in their everyday life on the ground, uh, and what they are thinking, what their future aspirations. Culture is not something which is a thing. It is also
Yep.
something which is a becoming.
I agree with you, Dr. Malik. Sorry, we're running very short of time.
Awareness on these things, I think, is very, very important.
Absolutely agree with you. Thank you so much, Dr. Malik. Just going to you, Dr. Vinita Sinha, just same question. What do you think our collective attention should be focused on?
Thank you. So let me just first respond to the other thing you had said about is sex and gender-based violence a unique crime, and I do want to address that, right? And as we have all agreed, sex gender-based violence is not about sex. It's first and foremost about power and domination, right? It's calculated, deliberate, and willful. And the majority of the victims are girls and women. It causes tremendous physical, psychological, emotional harm and suffering. It erodes women's right to life, health, bodily integrity, security, political participation, deprives them of liberty and living in fear. So I think, I certainly agree with, both the panelists that there is a need for a broad-based approach that requires collaborations and partnerships with different stakeholders in this. And we've mentioned all the stakeholders, holders from NGOs to civil society groups, to states themselves, to communities, to media partnerships, right? I think that kind of an approach is definitely needed. Now, on the question of should we hang the rapist, right? I mean, that's a very controversial thing to say, and feminists themselves are divided on this, absolutely. And there's if you look at the literature on crime and deviance, there's a lot that's been said on what is called the deterrence doctrine, right? This whole question of, if harsher the law, is it less likelihood that a crime will be committed? Now, in the case of rape in the Indian context, right, the horrendous Nirbhaya of 2012 episode that we all recall in such visceral ways even today, where the rapists were hung, does not seem to have worked. I mean, if you look at the number of cases that have come out of India, reported cases, certainly that's not, doesn't seem to have worked. So that's clearly perhaps not the most effective way to reduce the instances of sex and gender-based violence. But it is important to ask what the death sentence of hanging for rape signals, right? Even if it's a symbolic and rhetorical refusal by a community to condone this act, right? And the discourses that I've heard about rapes, in South Asia, and particularly gang rapes and brutal rapes. I mean, all rapes are horrendous. Send shivers down the spine, right? And I think one of the key issues you raised, Naz, was, why isn't there a greater kind of outrage, more collective outrage from different constituencies, right? Not just by survivors or women's groups and feminist groups. And I think one of the problems really is that very often these are seen to be women's problems or women's affairs, right? And they get ghettoized in those terms, which really lets large segments of the community off the hook, in a sense, right? And I think that's where the conversation needs to begin, right? One needs to ask, who needs to participate in this discussion? Who needs to be involved in order to bring about meaningful changes? And of course, I'm all for women and survivors being agentic and being assertive and expressing themselves. But I think, just calling on women to continuously do the work also places an enormous burden and responsibility on them, right? And I think, men do need to be a part of that conversation and to take, it's, and I also here want to distinguish between maleness and femaleness and men and women, right? Because they're completely different things in that sense. So we know a lot of women who are not feminists, right? We know a lot of women who are patriarchs, and likewise we know men who are feminists as well. So it's about the perspective, right, that you adopt. So I think, men need to be a part of this conversation, and I think, public education, raising awareness, media campaigns, and I think in particular life skills for girls, right? And I'm very keen to emphasize this point that it is about socialization. It is about creating alternative pathways to education, employment, better health and enhanced political participation for women so that they are empowered through those very concrete changes that are taking place. And of course, strengthening our institutions, legal institutions, our police and courts, and sensitizing them to gender, etc., are crucial. So it's not any one particular factor, but it's all of these factors having to work together in particular places that I think they think will make the difference. And if I may just have another minute to say a few more things in closing. And, I think all of us on this panel would agree that one takeaway from this panel should not be that sex and gender-based violence is somehow endemic and unique to South Asia. And I think, Dr. Chaudhry alluded to this, and Dr. Malik as well, that, there's nothing about this part of the world that naturally, produces this level of violence, right? And we've all pointed to systemic and structural factors. And, as an anthropologist, I'm very mindful of how difference is exoticized and at the same time denigrated, which I think is what very much happens in these kinds of discussions. So it's an irony that, there's a long history of sex and gender-based violence in South Asia and other parts of the world. But in South Asia in particular, there's also a long history of feminist activism, right? I mean, some of the strongest women's groups exist in South Asia, and this is not a modern phenomenon, right? I mean, this goes back centuries. So it's really an irony, and it's a very counterintuitive moment to be in, right? That, despite the presence of these feminist, efforts over the centuries, we are still, in a sense, standing at ground zero, right? And if I can just take a lesson from my own work that I'm doing on constructing, university policies against sexual harassment, I think societies need to approach and adopt a zero tolerance attitude to sex and gender-based violence. For one case is too many. I think, that's the kind of attitude, and that's the kind of moral outrage one needs to feel, together with all the other institutional work that absolutely needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. I think we have, in general, reached a consensus. I definitely see common patterns in all the closing comments today. A zero tolerance view on such matters, absolutely hands down, and HerWILL's absolutely 100% committed towards that as well, towards building that collective consciousness, towards building that collective outrage as well, and organizing of solidarity of the social movement and the civil societies and the civil mobilization that we spoke about. Creating more tropes, that was another excellent point raised in terms of school text, textbook, literature, and that sort of, the history and the heritage. The fact that South Asian countries of India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, they have had a rich history of feminism, rich history of South Asian feminists. Another aspect to be very aware of, very proud of, and mobilizing those aspects of the culture rather than attacking, taking an attacking view on a lot of it, I think was, again, harshening the laws doesn't always deliver. That's another thing that we've also spoken about. And lastly, I believe, whether this is a women-centric problem, whether this problem only belongs to women or a community or society as a whole, that is a very, very pertinent question that we all need to ask ourselves on an individual level and as a community. Thank you so much to... Sorry,
I think
yes.
we missed one thing, that there are hundreds and thousands of boys also who are raped throughout the world.
Absolutely. So it is a struggle against patriarchy. It's not, we're not in any sort of shape or form using divisive methods to separate any gender at that. It is a fight against patriarchy. It is a struggle against patriarchy. Thank you so much to this amazing panel with incredible wealth of knowledge that you've shared and kickstarted this conversation and kickstarted our mission to end violence, gender-based, sex and gender-based violence. Thank you so much to each and every panelist. Dr. Vinita Sinha, Dr. Elora Chaudhary, Dr. Nadeem Malik for being with us. Thank you for joining this panel. And thanks to our audience for joining today.